Okay, so brace yourself. I'm going to take you through the tetralogy according to this hastily assembled family tree and through the lens of Shakespeare's 4 plays. I will attempt to piece the history together. So, King Edward III had 4 sons. In order of their birth, they are Edward, the Black Prince, you can see on the far left, Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund, the Duke of York. Prince Edward dies in battle, and Edward III dies shortly afterwards, causing the prince's son Richard II to become king, even though he's still a small child. So we can see all of the kings in this little diagram because I have put them in capital letters. You can probably barely see that, but we will underline him here. So that's Richard II becoming king, despite his youth, and his uncles, John of Gaunt, from the House of Lancaster, and later Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. They're not shown in here, but they run things until Richard II comes of age. So now, moving on to Richard II. So Richard II doesn't rule very well, raises money for his extravagances by selling the right to collect taxes to many noblemen. John of Gaunt, so that's one of his uncles, accuses him of being England's landlord, not its king, and Gaunt's son, so Richard's cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, quarrels with the Duke of Norfolk, so Richard II banishes him for 6 years. Before this time is done, John of Gaunt dies, which should make Henry the new Duke of Lancaster upon his return, but Richard II takes the Lancaster land and wealth for himself. So Henry raises an army and immediately returns to England, not only to reclaim his land, but also to take the throne of England for himself. When he arrives, however, Richard is away fighting a war, and Edmund, the Duke of York, is in charge. So rather than fighting Henry off, Edmund senses which way the wind is blowing and lets Henry take over. When Richard returns, Edmund gives him the bad news that Henry IV is now king, and Richard II is imprisoned. So this is Henry IV's time, as we see over here. However, Edmund's sons, Richard and Aumerle, are still loyal to Richard II, and they start plotting against Henry IV. Henry IV discovers the plot but decides to forgive them if they swear loyalty to him. He then has Richard II killed to prevent others from trying to restore him to the throne. So now we move on to what would constitute the plots of Henry IV parts 1 and 2, so Shakespeare's Henry IV parts 1 and 2. So since Richard dies without any children, as you can see over here, the legal line of succession should have gone to Lionel, the Duke of Clarence, who was the second son of Edward III. Lionel, however, is already dead by this point, but his grandchildren realise that they have a more rightful claim to the throne than Henry IV. They also have powerful allies like Glendower and Hotspur. So there's Hotspur there and Glendower over here. So they raise an army and go to war against Henry IV. Various other groups in this time also rebel, but with the help of his son, Prince Hal, and Hal is Henry V, known as Prince Hal. So with the help of Prince Hal, Henry IV wins all the wars. He then dies of natural causes, and Prince Hal becomes King Henry V. So, looking at Henry V, he has even loftier aims and decides that he has a more legitimate claim to the throne of France than its current king. So he goes to France, defeats the French army at the Battle of Agincourt, famously, becomes king and marries the French king's daughter, Princess Catherine. By this time, Aumerle is the Duke of York and has served both Henry IV and Henry V faithfully, but his brother, Richard of Cambridge, this guy, plots against Henry V, is arrested and is executed. Aumerle dies in the battles of Agincourt. Since he has no children, as we can see there, the title of Duke of York goes to Richard of Cambridge's son, Richard, this guy, whose mother is the great-granddaughter of Lionel, the Duke of Clarence. So all the way back up here. Therefore, that Richard has a more legitimate claim to the throne than Henry V. He also has a personal grudge against Henry V and the Lancastrians for killing his father, and he now has the wealth and power as the new Duke of York to act on his ambitions. Henry V dies of dysentery, while his and Catherine's son, Henry VI, is still a small child. As Henry VI grows up, Richard of York has plenty of time to build his power. So this is Henry VI still growing up, and Richard over here gaining his power as he watches the little Henry VI grow. Then we get into the realm of sort of Henry VI, parts 1, 2 and 3. Joan of Arc shows up to help the French regain their country from English rule and gets killed by the English. Henry VI is a weak king, but his wife, Margaret of Anjou, as you can just about make out that I've scrawled here, is very strong and very ambitious. Richard of York and his allies make their move, and the War of the Roses begins. Okay. The tide of battle goes back and forth several times, as do various alliances. When Richard of York is on top, he tries to declare himself king, but he is captured by the Lancasters. Margaret has his head cut off and sends it to his sons, Edward VI, Clarence and Richard of Gloucester, wearing a paper crown. This annoys them, and when the tide turns back in their favour, they kill Margaret's son, Edward. So they kill this guy. Edward, Clarence and Richard manage to capture Henry VI, and Richard of Gloucester, our Richard, kills him. Edward IV becomes king. It would seem that the troubles are over, but Richard of Gloucester is already plotting to make himself king. So Edward becomes king now, but our Richard is starting to think he might have somewhere to go with this as well. So Richard, as we know, kills everyone in the York family who stands between him and the throne, as well as Henry VI's widow Margaret, Prince Edward's widow Lady Anne, who he marries first, and a variety of other people. But if we go back up here to Princess Catherine, the widow of Henry V, she remarried Owen Tudor and had a son named Edmund Tudor over here. And do you remember John of Gaunt, the first Duke of Lancaster that we met? Where is John of Gaunt? Here he is. By his third wife, he had a son who then had a daughter named Margaret Beaufort. Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort, and their son was Henry of Richmond, which should ring a bell by now. Technically of the House of Tudor, but also the last of the Lancasters. He appears over the horizon with an army, kills Richard III, becomes King Henry VII, and marries Elizabeth, who, as the daughter of Edward IV, is the last of the Yorks, and a legitimate heir to the throne as the great-great-great-granddaughter of Lionel. So you see how it all comes together, hence Richmond's speech at the end of the play that everything is finally tied up and as it should be. Their son is Henry VIII, whose daughter is Elizabeth I, who is queen when Shakespeare begins writing these plays. Phew!